In this video, I'll be building a huge ecosystem paludarium for my captive bred cast of purple vampire crabs. This paludarium ends up being one of my longest running projects, running for 475 days before I had to move apartments and break it all down. The tank I'm using is a custom made 100 by 35 by 30 centimeter 75 liter or 20 gallon paludarium style tank. To create the background for this tank, I made a mold out of corrugated black plastic, then added a random assortment of sticks from my backyard to make it look a bit more natural. Next, I sprayed in some expanding foam to lock everything into place, and later this will all be carved back to make a realistic rock looking texture. When using expanding foam, just be prepared for it to expand quite a lot, so don't go overboard with it because you'll be cutting it back for hours otherwise. As well as making a background, I also made a little divider using a similar method, which I'll be using as a separation barrier between the water section and the soil section. After hours and hours of carving, this is our basic layout. If you are doing this, just make sure you cut back all of the smooth surfaces because it won't work properly when we get to the next step. And I ended up cutting it into 3 different sections to fit in the tank a little bit easier. Behind the water barrier foam wall, there is also a black piece of corrugated plastic that is siliconed into place. This is how I'll be keeping the water section and the land section separate. Just make sure you leak test this barrier really well because if it does fail, your entire tank will be compromised. So double check very carefully. There are a few drawbacks to using this method over a clay ball underlayer method, but I'll cover those a little bit later on in the video. Now that I know everything fits, I'm covering it all with a layer or 2 layers of tile grout. Basically cement. American viewers, you will probably know this stuff as dry lock. I'm just going to be painting it on with a paintbrush, letting it dry overnight, then applying a second layer and waiting for another 24 hours. Now that the background is ready, I'm also going to experiment with growing some moss over it by blending some moss in with some aqua soil. So you're basically just aiming to make a little bit of paste here. So use some moss, some aqua soil and a little bit of water. Blend it all together and then paint it all over the surfaces that you want to cover with moss. Really quick and easy, and it usually works pretty well. Mine didn't work quite well, but also I'll cover that later in a video as well. I should have seen it coming, but it's definitely something to pay attention to. Next comes a substrate layout for the land section, which is about 5 centimeters of clay balls or leca. This will keep the soil nice and dry and above any water which builds up over time. Generally, this is caused by misting and condensation, so you do really need to make sure you add this layer in. It's very important. On top of that, I'm adding a layer of weed matting, but you can use window screen or something similar if you have access to it. This is just to keep the next layer of soil out of the drainage layer. For the soil layer, I'm going to be using organic potting soil or potting mix. Fertilizer-free soils are really important, and don't bother with any fancy mixes because vampire crabs prefer good old-fashioned plain soil. Even soil from your backyard works perfectly fine, as long as you know it hasn't been sprayed by poison or fertilizer. Before planting everything, I'm going to be adding a random selection of hardscape, so some wood, rocks, sticks, mosses, and a few other knickknacks, including my favorite item here, a beaver skull that I found. Most of the wood is alder and birch, 2 of the safe options, so if you are doing this, make sure you avoid pine, cypress, and any other really sappy woods. While I'm adding all of this stuff to the tank, I'm also seeding it with springtails, worms, and isopods. Pretty much all of the stuff I'm using is covered in all of these, but if you are using stuff without it, make sure you do add springtails. They are super important, and any tank without them is destined to fail. This is a selection of plants that I'm going to be using. I'll leave a full list in the description, as well as all the other details from products that I'm using for this build. There are obviously a lot of other plant options available, so feel free to use any ideas that you come across. Just make sure they like wet, humid environments and you'll be perfectly fine. Over the course of the next 1.5 years, I did end up changing a few things here and there. I removed some plants and added some others, mostly because they got eaten by the crabs, though there were a couple that died off because they were in the corners and didn't get enough light. Planting the tank is really easy. Just make sure that you plant the smaller growing plants at the front of the tank and the taller growing ones at the back. Otherwise, you'll block the view from pretty much everything, and you'll spend way more time doing maintenance than you really need to. I like to add the water section substrate last so I can clean up any soil that spills into the water area. And for this, I'm using a small grained gravel, so a natural river style gravel mixed with a little bit of sand. Then I'm filling it with dechlorinated tap water. Things are looking really good so far. The shoreline's looking nice, so I'm just going to mist everything before we start moving on to the aquatic section where we start planting the aquatic plants and filling it up with water. For the aquatic plants that I'm using, I'm just going to be adding some trimmings from one of my aquariums, most of which is bits of dwarf sage followed by quite a few floating plants. In this case, I'm going to be using Salvinia, pretty much the best one available. If you don't plan on using a filter, floating plants are really important. They'll suck up any excess nutrients and provide a good food source for your crabs. Although it's completely optional, I am going to be adding a tiny little filter to one end of the tank just to circulate a bit of water. I don't end up keeping this in the tank permanently, I just got sick of cleaning it and it's definitely not required. After a week I broke down my breeding tank and ended up moving my entire cast of Geosesama denula purple vampire crabs into their new home. Ideally you should wait about a month, but I know what I'm doing, I've done this plenty of times, so I know what to be aware of when doing this. But if you're new to this, definitely wait about a month. Your tank will cycle through all of the mold processes and you'll get a way better start and you won't have to stress so much about your tank. Believe it or not, all of these crabs came from a single pair, a male and a female, and they're all from the same generation. As you can see, they all grow at very different rates, so some of them are quite big and some of them are still quite small. And importantly, if you don't feed your babies really well, they will cannibalize each other and you will lose a lot of them. So make sure if you have them in a small tank while you're growing them, make sure you feed them really, really well. After 128 days, the environment has undergone some pretty big changes. Most of the plants have grown quite a lot, especially the white Fittonia, and the crabs have also made themselves quite at home, with the males roaming around openly during the day and spending a lot of time brawling at night. They are also molting without any problems, which means the water section is cycled fully and the nitrogen cycle is working exactly as nature intended. And while things are mostly peaceful in the tank, the males do occasionally duke it out for the top dominance position, so whenever you see them shaking their claws, you know trouble isn't too far away. I've also added a red spot plant to the front of the tank here, which seems to be growing exceptionally fast, and the crabs seem to love to climb it and to spend time hiding on top of the bigger leaves. Unfortunately, my moss wall blend on the back wall didn't work out as planned, as I introduced the crabs quite early and they ended up eating all of the small bits of moss before I got to take hold. Though that was easily fixed by adding some extra bits of bigger moss, which started to spread over time. There are still some negative aspects of this tank and the design, but I'll cover those in the next phase for day 475. Fast forward to day 475, this is the final day of the tank, and in a few hours I'll be stripping it down for a brand new project. Some of you will know that this build is one of the very first builds that I uploaded to this channel, and that this video is actually a remaster of the original video. So there are a few important things that I did learn while building this that I'd like to go over with now. And lesson 1 is the trouble with foam. The first and most important thing that I learnt while making this ecosystem tank is that it relies heavily on foams and plastics and quite a bit of glue. While this looks quite nice and works reasonably well, it doesn't ever really feel like an organic recreation of nature. It's just a thin layer of life on top of a toxic core, and it's the main reason that I haven't made another build on this channel using spray foam. Sure, it's easy, but there are more rewarding and organic ways to create an ecosystem, a lot of which I've been using for my more recent videos, and it definitely makes looking at the tank and the long-term lasting effects of it feel much more natural. Lesson 2, the design flaws and some things that I would fix. The second issue with this tank is the core design. Having a solid separation barrier between the water section and the land section isn't optimal. I know this is quite a popular method that people use, but the biggest issue with this is that evaporation and condensation build up on the land side over time, which requires regular draining to prevent any water building up and turning it into a swamp. While this is avoidable by using a small drainage siphon on the back side of the tank, like the one I've created here, it's generally more work than it needs to be, which is why I've switched entirely over to doing full underlay style builds, which utilize clay balls and gravel. It's a flawless system and one that I highly suggest you use if you have the option and you want to try something a lot easier to work with. If you've been paying attention as well, you would have also spotted a rogue red crab in this tank. He is an escaped Geosesama Hagen, or a red devil. I had a few babies escape from their tubs a while back and I found him crawling on the floor, just a brown little crab. And unfortunately when they are this tiny it's impossible to tell which species they are, so I had to roll the dice and I put him into a tank which I thought he came out of, but that turns out to be the wrong choice, and as you know, mixing crabs is usually a death sentence, but somehow this guy managed to survive, all whilst evading my attempts to catch him. While he's currently in one piece here, I did see him with missing claws and missing legs quite often, so he was definitely being hunted quite heavily. Although I ended up stripping this tank down after 475 days and starting fresh, it was still a very successful project, and one that bred hundreds upon hundreds of baby crabs, a lot of which found new homes here locally. And other than my dislike of spray foam builds, the method works well, which is clearly evident by how long it lasted. But if you do want to create something in your own tank, either a big or small tank, I highly suggest doing so with a more organic mindset. You'll appreciate it a lot more in the long run, and if you are looking for inspiration for your next project, check out this playlist here because it has a lot of new interesting builds that don't use any spray foam.